Well, thanks for joining us here today on our 2022 Dairy Goat webinar series from the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. My name is Jennifer Bentley. I'm the Dairy Field Specialist here in Northeast Iowa. And I'm joined today by my colleagues, Larry Tranel and Brian Dougherty, who will both be delivering today's information, as well as my colleague from Northwest Iowa, Fred Hall. He's our Dairy Field Specialist out in Northwest, who will also be helping to facilitate some of today's questions. But today, before we start our webinar, just a few things to take note of while we're on Zoom. If you could just mute your microphones and turn off your cameras during the presentations. If you have questions during the presentations, go ahead and type those into the chat box and we'll address those either after each presentation or at the end, depending on how many questions we have there. But feel free to type those in as they come up. We are going to record this webinar, so it will be recorded and archived for you to view later on. After we get done with the webinar here today, I will email that out to you, the link that will be posted out to our YouTube channel, so you can look at that later. I also will post in the chat box an evaluation link that you can click on after the webinar here today, and that helps us just provide a good evaluation of how our webinar series is going. So today we're going to focus on dairy goat housing, ventilation, and milking systems. A little bit of intro to my colleagues. Our first presenter is our Field Ag Engineer, Brian Dougherty. Brian works extensively with our Extension Dairy Team and has a great knowledge in dairy facilities, manure handling, water quality, and soil health. And prior to obtaining his engineering degrees from Iowa State University and Oregon State University, he was a co-owner and operator of a dairy farm near Waukon, Iowa. And then we'll follow up with my colleague, Larry Tranel, also a dairy field specialist housed in Northeast and Southeast Iowa. He'll be discussing the milking systems. Larry Tranel grew up on a Wisconsin dairy farm. He majored in ag economics and international studies with a master's in ag industry, all from UW-Platteville. He then spent 10 years as a dairy farm management agent with UW Extension and the past 20 years with ISU Extension as a dairy field specialist. He is known worldwide for his low-cost milking systems for dairy cattle, the Dairy Trans Iowa low-cost parlor, and today he's going to share with us how that can be adapted for use with our dairy goat milking systems. And prior to the start of the webinar here today, he did note that he was also a dairy goat producer as well, so he has some insight on milking dairy goats.
Okay, I'll jump into it here. So I'm going to cover a couple different topics. Start out here with just some basics on facility design, and then I'll get into more of the ventilation side of things. So on the facility side, we'll just go through a few of the different options that are out there in the industry, and then I want to talk a little bit about remodeling because that is something that people are interested in typically. A little bit on pen design, and then some feed and water space requirements. But before we even start here, I do want to acknowledge Dr. David Kammel from the University of Wisconsin. He's retired now, but he provided a lot of background information for this presentation. So shelter options, all kinds of different ways to house goats. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through, the different options because it's hard to give any just standard design recs because there are so many different variations from farm to farm, but you can use hoop barns or greenhouses. They can be a nice option. Post frame buildings, this can be, either purpose built for goats or, remodeled machine sheds or things like that you can put goats into. Old basement barns, that's fairly common that people will remodel those as well. They do have some challenges that I'm going to get into later on. And then more semi-permanent or portable shelter options. You can use carports, either portable or permanent, either way. Porta huts, calf huts, things like that. You can also house goats in. So there's lots of different ways to do this. Portable buildings on skids is another good option for certain situations if you need some temporary housing. But really what it boils down to is it really doesn't matter what type of facility you have, as long as it meets this criteria that are on the checklist here. So it needs to fit your management plan, provide a clean, dry environment for all of your different groups that you have, plenty of fresh air, feed and water, labor efficient, economical, safe, and environmentally friendly. So ideally, whatever type of facility you have, it will meet all of these criteria, or at least most of them. And if there's any of these you're not meeting, that's probably something you want to think about and try to work on. So I mentioned management plans. What is a management plan? What goes into it? So basically, this is just setting up the structure for how you're going to manage your animals. So you want to define what different groups you're going to have on the farm, and then how many animals are going to be in each group, and then determine the needs for those animals within those different groups. So what do they need for space requirements, for nutrition, treatment facilities? How are you going to move those animals between groups? How are you going to handle manure? Think about all of these things, then kind of list those out, what, as the owner maybe, or someone who works at the facility. So you want to consider the needs of, owners and the people that are working with these animals, and then determine what features that you would need to meet, those needs and wants. And unfortunately, there's never enough money to go around, when you do these kind of expansions or remodels or new builds. So more than likely, you're going to have to prioritize this list. You're probably not going to be able to afford to do everything and get everything you want. So what's most important, prioritize those first. And then some of the things that would be nice to have, you can add those if you have the money to do that. So renovation, is that something you want to consider? A lot of people are thinking about that. Again, it doesn't really necessarily matter how you go about this. It just needs to fit with the management plan. It needs to provide a comfortable space for those animals. Improve your labor efficiency would be ideal. And then think about future expansion. You don't want to build something and kind of box yourself in and not be able to add on to that in the future if that's something that you potentially might be doing. And then obviously cost effective. So just a general ballpark rule of thumb, if it's going to cost more than 70% to do a remodel is what it would cost to do a new build, you're probably just better off building new facilities, because remodels often come with challenges, and there's usually some compromises there with remodel facilities that you maybe wouldn't have with a new build. And just think about what resources you have before you go into a new build or in a remodel. Do you have enough land? Where are you going to get the feed? Are you growing that? Are you going to need to buy feed? Do you have enough labor to do that? And, do you have enough manure storage to make that work as well? There are possible limitations. So structural issues is a big one. You start remodeling these basement barns and things like that. Often there's posts in the way, low ceiling height, maybe not as much of a challenge for goats as it is, for Holsteins or something like that. But things in the way, posts, walls, gutters that need to be moved or relocated. You might have to add some structural beams. Water access is another one you want to think about. You may not have good access. Pipes might be corroded. You start getting into these projects and adding water. Sometimes that cost can be a little bit more than you initially thought it was going to be. And wiring is another big one in older facilities. A lot of those old dairy barns aren't up to code when it comes to wiring. So that might be something you're going to have to spend some money on. And then ventilation, I'm going to talk about that in the next session, but that's often a challenge with remodels. As far as pen design criteria, again, just make sure you have enough space for those animals. They're dry bedded and comfortable. That's really what it boils down to. Draft free. I'll talk about that in the next session. And you just want to manage those temperature extremes, 50 to 60 degrees for your adults, 54 to 65 for kids is kind of ideal. And then you can work from there. So fencing and dividers, 4 to 5 feet high is the recommendation for does, 6 feet for bucks. There's different ways you can do dividers. You can do wood, you can do wire panels. There's lots of different options. Wood can work fine. They do tend to want to chew on that, so you're probably going to have some maintenance costs over time. But you just need to be careful with these wire mesh panels that they're not getting their head stuck in it, essentially. Sometimes two of them might try to put their head in the same hole. So general recommendations, 4x4 for young goats, 6x6 inches for your adult goats, or larger, so they're not getting their heads stuck in those panels. And definitely if you've got any horned goats, you're going to want to avoid those type of panels. Feeder design, ideally that should be above the floor just to keep that feed clean so they're not getting manure into it, reduces parasite spread between animals. Throat height, somewhere around 18 inches for does. If you're using the slant bar type feeder designs, there's different spacing recommendations for those, depending on the age of the animal, that you can see there, anywhere from 4 to 7 inches. And resting area recommendations. So I'm not going to take the time to go through this whole chart. I believe Jen's going to put a link in the chat box where you'll be able to access a PDF of both of these presentations. So you'll have this as a reference, but the space requirement really is going to depend on what type of housing. Do you have an outside dirt lot? Is it total confinement? How are they being managed? So you take a look at that in the handout for what the current space recommendations are. And then it's the same thing here for feed and water recommendations. Again, it depends on whether you're limit feeding or if they have feed available around the clock. You can get by with less feeding space, but the feeding space and watering space recommendations are in this table, and you can take a look at those in the handout. So just to wrap up quickly here on the facility side, a lot of different facility options can be made to work if they meet the design criteria. Again, make sure they have enough space, enough water, clean bedded, dry, fresh air. Those are kind of the key points you want to try to hit. Assess your resources, limitations before you do a remodel project. Make sure you've got adequate bedding space. Again, keep them clean and healthy, and then follow those feed and water space recommendations to maximize production. So I'm going to jump right into the ventilation part here, and we can take a few questions at the end if there are any. So getting into ventilation, I'm just going to talk some of the basics of ventilation, why you want to ventilate, and then I'll talk about natural ventilation versus some mechanical designs, positive pressure tube systems, and positive and negative pressure and mechanical ventilation. But before you update your ventilation or spend any money on ventilation, it's always a good idea to make sure if you're having issues, if you've got animals that are coughing, I encourage people to work with their veterinarian and try to do some culturing and see what's actually causing that. Because if you've got contagious type diseases that are spreading through the herd, improving your ventilation, while it might help a little bit on the edges, provide a healthier environment, it's not going to fix that problem. You're really going to have to look at other options, your colostrum management. Are they getting enough energy? Again, are they clean and dry? What's your vaccination program? Things like that. If it does turn out to be one of these environmental causes, like Pasteurella, things like that, then improving your ventilation can definitely help, more so than if it's a contagious cause. So just try to identify what the cause is if you're having health issues. So what is ventilation? Just very basically, when I talk about ventilation, that's bringing fresh air into the building. It's not recirculating air that's already in the building. So when we talk about ventilation, we're really talking about bringing in fresh air. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. So why do we need to worry about this? Basically, you want that fresh air being pushed into the barn because it displaces the heat, the noxious gases, odors, moisture, dust, airborne pathogens, all of that. You want to get all that stuff out of the barn to keep your animals healthier and more productive. It can help with fly control, reduce your condensation and dripping on ceilings and walls, but you have to be careful with how you design this so you're not, creating a draft on those animals during cold weather. Air quality targets, so ammonia levels below 10 parts per million, and you want to measure that at nose level. There are gas meters you can get that can measure that. They tend to be a little expensive. You can try these little just ammonia test strips. They're not quite as sensitive, but they'll give you a ballpark readout of what your ammonia levels are. And then your relative humidity, ideally between 50 and 75%. But the main thing is you don't want it to be drastically different than whatever the outdoor relative humidity is, because if there's a big difference, you're most likely going to have some condensation problems. This is a nice little flow chart that was put together by Dr. David Kammel, and it just kind of walks you through, how do you go about selecting or deciding what type of ventilation you need. And so you can take a look at this again in the handout, but Does your barn have a ceiling or not? If it does, it's probably not a good, candidate for natural ventilation, because that tends to not work very well in low ceiling buildings. But if it doesn't, or you can remove that ceiling, then some sort of mechanical system, if it's tightly constructed, if the ceiling cannot be removed, you probably want to look at a mechanical type ventilation system. So natural ventilation, why would you want to think about that? Well, the main reason a lot of people do it is it's very low cost, low maintenance, simple way to ventilate. If you've got good access to wind, you don't have buildings nearby that are blocking that airflow. You don't have a low ceiling or something that's going to obstruct that airflow. That's a good candidate for a natural ventilation system. To make this work, you want to have an open eave and ridge design. So that allows fresh air to come in through the eave and then up and out the ridge vent. And you need to have some slope on the roof. This is why, flat roof buildings or buildings with ceilings don't tend to work well for natural ventilation, because that warm air needs to be able to rise and, be carried up and out the ridge vent for this to work well. Somewhere around 50% or more of the open sidewall is ideal here, free from wind shadows from other buildings. And then the east-west orientation tends to work a little bit better here, as far as catching more airflow in the summertime to keep them cool, and then, protecting them from the sun. So I mentioned the ridge, just kind of standard recommendation across the dairy industry is 2 inches of ridge opening per 10 foot of building width. And then on the eaves, an inch on either side per 10 foot of building width. In that case, if you're worried about snow getting into the building or rain, you can cap those. You can use cupolas. There's different designs and ways to keep that, rain and snow out of the barn. If you do that, you just want to make sure your cupola opening is equal to, whatever the ridge opening recommendation would be in the alternative there. But there are challenges with natural ventilation. Sometimes it just doesn't work as well. So in the summertime, sometimes you don't have good wind speed. So this is actually showing a windrows. This is from Dubuque, but you can find these for different areas of the state. And so basically what this is showing is the wind speed and the wind direction. So this is looking at, August in Dubuque. And so you can see primarily those winds are coming from the south. But even in these conditions, there are, about 10 to 11% of the time what we would consider still air. So there's just basically not enough airspeed to properly ventilate that building in that case. So there are challenges in really hot weather. Sometimes you don't have enough airspeed with these naturally ventilated buildings. And then in the wintertime, there's also challenges because sometimes there's temperature inversions. So can actually be colder inside the barn than outside. This tends to happen kind of mid-morning when the sun comes up, starts to warm up outside. It takes a few hours for the temperature in that building to catch up. And when that happens, basically you have warmer air coming in your eave opening and it just goes up and right out the ridge vent, and it doesn't drop down and ventilate that barn the way it should. And it ends up basically trapping, poor quality air down near the floor. And so that can be a challenge in the wintertime with natural ventilation. So a lot of people have gone to positive pressure tube ventilation systems. These can work in lots of different facilities. They're pretty flexible on the design, but they do need to be properly designed for each facility. You can't just buy a cookie cutter one off the shelf. You're probably not going to be happy with it. It has to be designed to target that airflow at the proper speed and proper location. And these are typically designed for wintertime ventilation, about 4 air changes per hour for that building is how we design these. And generally we recommend just running those year round, and they should give you uniform air discharge down the full length of that tube if they're properly designed. So just a schematic of how that looks here. And so the way we typically design these is shoot for about 60 feet of airspeed per minute directly above the animals, so maybe 3 feet off the floor in the case of goats. But again, they need to be properly designed so you're not blowing a draft on those animals. You have to have the properly sized fan and the proper tube with the holes in the right locations to make this work. Here's an example of what you don't want to see. So that fan needs to be pulling fresh air in or forcing fresh air in from outside the building. It's the way these positive pressure tubes work. You do not want the fan inside the building because all that does is just recirculate poor quality air and pathogens throughout the whole barn. And again, the tube and the fan need to be properly sized. The holes need to be properly sized because that's what, dictates what the airspeed is going to be coming out of the tube. So here's showing a good installation. So the fan is in the exterior wall. It's covered with an oversized hood to protect that fan and keep it from sucking snow in. And then the tube is properly located, properly sized holes. So this is what you want to see with the positive pressure tube system installation. Then we get into other mechanical systems. So why might you want to consider this? Maybe you've got a low ceiling building. You've got other buildings around that are blocking wind access. Natural ventilation just isn't going to work. Really tight construction. So if that's your scenario, you might want to look at some sort of mechanical ventilation, either positive or negative pressure. The advantage of these type of systems, they do tend to give you a little bit more control over the environment in the barn. So the way a negative pressure system works is that fan is located in the sidewall, and that's actually forcing air out of the building. And then you'd have inlets located opposite the fan where the fresh air would be pulled in. So these can work well if you have evenly distributed inlets so that fresh air coming in isn't creating a draft on the animals, and it's creating a relatively even air distribution throughout the building. That's the trick to making these work properly. A positive pressure system, basically you just flip the fan around. So in this case, you're forcing fresh air into the barn. So this is similar to the positive pressure tube design. You just don't have a tube attached to that fan. These tend to work better in buildings where you have large uncontrolled openings. Maybe you have a large door that needs to stay open for the animals to come in and out. You don't have a good way to control where that air comes in. So if that's the case, these can work. You can locate those fans in areas of the barn that have poor airflow and force fresh air in, and then just let it go out your doors and other large openings. Mechanical ventilation rates, there's kind of two different ways to design these systems. You can do it based on cubic feet of air per minute per head, or CFM, or the other way you can design them is just based on an air exchange rate. And so we do that based on air changes per hour. So for example, in cold weather at 4 air changes per hour, basically what that means is every 15 minutes, you're displacing the entire volume of air in that building. And that tends to be the way we design these air changes per hour, because it's just a little easier to design that way. You always have fresh air, and you don't have to worry about how many animals are in the building. But again, this chart will be in your handouts or in your downloads, so you can take a look at this for reference. So just to summarize on the ventilation, again, I encourage people to work with their veterinarian to determine what's causing your issues before you spend a lot of money trying to upgrade a ventilation system, because it's not a magical fix. Choose the right ventilation system. Take a look at that flow chart, look at your building, see what your situation is, and pick the right type of ventilation for the location of your barn and the construction type of that barn. Natural ventilation is a great option. It's low cost, very little work involved, but it does has its drawbacks. In both summer and winter, there are times where it just doesn't work very well. And that's where these properly designed positive pressure tube systems can really, be a benefit. If you've got a barn that's got some challenging ventilation, considerations, maybe you've got a really low ceiling or it's an odd shape or something like that. Those are good candidates for these positive pressure tube systems. You can target that fresh air where you need it. And these fully mechanical systems with fans in the sidewall, either bringing air in or out, they can work, but they do require some fine tuning. You need to have controls on those for temperature or humidity or both. And you have to be monitoring those systems to make sure that they're functioning properly. So they can be a little bit more challenging to control temperature, especially if you're trying to keep that barn warm. That sometimes can cause some health issues. So it can be done, but it's just a little bit more challenging to make that work. If you're looking for more resources, I'd encourage you to check out the ISU Dairy Team webpage. So you can just do a web search and find that. And under the herd management tab, you can find some information for dairy goats and sheep there. So that's all I had. I will stop sharing here. We can take any questions if there are any, or we can move on to Larry.
Yep, thanks, Brian. And as Larry is sharing his screen here, I did have a question that came in about just asking about hoop buildings, how they work for dairy goat housing.
Yeah, so I mean, they're a little bit low cost compared to a stick built, obviously. The one challenge that you have with hoop buildings is often they don't have a ridge vent. And so you can get away with buildings up to 70 feet or so long if you just put an opening on either end up near the ridge and you've got that oriented so the wind can blow through that building. If you get longer than that, then you're probably going to want to make sure that if you're going to buy a hoop building, you can buy designs that have a ridge vent designed into them. So yeah, they can work fine. That would be the main consideration with those hoop buildings is, does it have a ridge vent or not? And the other thing with those is we actually recommend orienting those north and south rather than east west, because then in the summertime you get the wind blowing through that building, you know, the long way, because they tend to have a little bit lower sidewalls. And so if you can basically turn that building 90 degrees, that tends to work a little bit better for those hoop type buildings.
All right, thanks for your presentation here today, Brian, and for answering that question. If there's any more questions that come in, we'll take those at the end. So go ahead and put those into the chat box. I did put Brian's presentation into the chat box as well. So you are able to download that, and I'll do the same with Larry's here as well. If you can't download it from the chat box, I will do a follow-up email that will include the 2 attachments. So with that, thanks, Brian, and we'll go ahead with our dairy goat milking systems with Larry.
So can you hear me just doing a sound check?
Yes, okay. I can hear you.
So we'll get into the dairy goat milking system. So yeah, I'm a former dairy goat operator as well. I like to build milking parlors, whether it be for cows or goats. It's just kind of a fascination of mine. And so we'll just kind of take a look at what we might take a look at with some of the dairy goats here. And I'm not able to, there it goes. Okay, so when you take a look at the similarities between dairy goat parlors and dairy cow parlors, there definitely are a lot of similarities. And are they similar? Kind of yes and no, I would tend to say. There definitely are some differences that we tend to have with the dairy goat ones. Basically, the goats have drier feces. They tend to move a little faster than our dairy cows tend to move. There's no doubt they're related to the deer, so they tend to jump higher. They have the 2 teat attachment versus the 4. Headlock wise, we probably want to make sure we've got our goats in headlocks. They're going to be jumping all over the place. And we tend to feed in the parlor, where in our dairy cow parlors, we don't feed in there. And I would also say that they're probably safer to milk, basically just because of size and their inability. They don't seem like they kick quite as much as what some dairy cows might do. So the first thing when we look at building parlors, a lot of these parlors get built by a lot of the people themselves that are producing the milk and milking the goats. They're not as tough to build, I don't think, as a lot of people imagine once they kind of get the feel for what's going on here. So the bottom line is, you know, just when you take a look at platform width, so A there on the platform here is just how far do we want this platform to be here. So usually it's around 3 feet, but I've seen them as low as 30. Some get up even into that 40 inch range. So it really depends on the size of the goats and things like that. But you want to make sure that those back feet are actually pretty darn close to the back here. So it makes it a little bit easier for you to actually get up there and milk there. The neck height on these parlors, typically in that 14 to 18 range. I've seen a lot of them in 16, 17, 18 inches. And as long as that feed is pretty elevated, not a big deal. But sometimes when you take a look at different types of feed bunks for goats, you don't want something quite this high. If they're you know, eating some forages and things like that, and actually eating off the ground, you want to make sure that they don't have the throat cut on them as well. So you might want to kind of have the size of the neck height there, depending on the feed bunk again, of course. So stall spacing between the goats here, letter C, around 14 inches, 12 to 16 is a kind of a good range. It again depends on the size of your goats. The pit depth is one that I think people shortchange. in a lot of respects, because somebody that's about 6 foot tall should have a pit depth of about 42 inches. Okay, and that gets kind of difficult if you're expecting your goats to jump up that high. But when you start taking a look at somebody that's 5'10", you just take 2 inches off of that for 40 inches. And that basically gives an operator the ability to actually try to milk these goats a little bit easier without having to bend so far, especially bending their head down forward, because I tend to say that it's a lot easier for shorter people to milk up than it is for a taller person to bend down even 1 inch to try to milk downward. So the kick rail here, anywhere between 18 to 24 inches. A lot of operations that don't even have the kick rail behind here. Well, again, whether they're jumping up from the floor or whether they're coming in from the side, and there's still quite a few that don't even have the kick rail there. When we take a look at, there's a big goat udder here, no doubt, but when you take a look at pit depth, this is kind of what we want. So we want to make sure that the back is kind of straight. And so when you look at these goat udder, I mean, that goat udder is going to be pretty darn close down here. And so they probably are going to still do some bending. And so even the 42 inches might not be enough for somebody that's 6 foot, depending where those goat udders are working with. The kick rail, again, is 18 to 24 inches. This one's actually about a 26, but if you get that down into here, right above the hock on the goat is a pretty good place to be it. So you want to be able to, like I say, belly up real close to the goat here so you don't have to bend over too much. And I didn't appreciate the Minnesota Viking thing on there, so I tried to make that an Iowa State type deal there. So when you look at this pit width, when you basically take a look at this, and I think this is about 3.5 to 4 feet, I would tend to say a 4 foot one tends to be pretty nice. 3 is a little bit narrow. I used to milk in a 3 foot pit. And definitely there wasn't much room for a second person to move back and forth if there was a second person in there. But one of the big things I think about the pit width here is these swing arms. As if in here we don't see, they're actually kind of hanging in here, but it's pretty easy, and I'll show in some slides later to make sure that we have some swing arms in here that can actually keep these hoses well out of the way. So even these narrower pit widths don't cause a problem as people are moving back and forth from one goat to the other. And the other thing is just the milk line clearance up here. Those swing arms actually assist with the milk line clearance up here as well. So in a lot of parlors, sometimes there's a unit per doe, there's a unit per 2 doe, sometimes a unit per 3 does. As they come in here. So it's kind of a lot of different variations that they work with here. The other thing I want to mention on this slide too is just the foot candles of the lighting in here. So you get into a lot of parlors, whether it be dairy cows or dairy goats, and it just seems like they're pretty dim. So both goats and cows respond to light. They come into things just because they might be lighter. Okay, so I think that lighting is a pretty important piece of it. And then the last piece I mentioned on this one too is just the concaveness of the floor, which there'll be a few slides that I can kind of show this, but we want to make sure that your toes are lower than your heels when you're milking, and when you're standing there by the goat, it just takes the stress off your back. And so we're looking at not just efficiency here, we're also looking at ergonomics and also safety with milking goats. So again, the pit width here is a pretty wide one, and the wider it is, the more steps you're going to take from one side to the other. Again, there's no swing arms in here, so these swing arms could actually have the ability to take these milk hoses and actually bring them way over here before they have to drop down, and it would actually take some of this unit pull that we see here as these units are being pulled. So the concave floor, so this all drains to the middle. I'd much more rather see the drains back over here or to the other side of the building here, so we can actually have a concaveness up there where the middle of this floor is actually higher than where the sides are on both sides. And again, so when you're standing by the goat, putting the unit on, your toes are going to be lower than your heels. So I think we covered some of these other things in here, and we take a look at just the head space. So here are some swing arms in here. So compared to the previous pictures, you know, what can you do to get those hoses out of the way? So even these narrow pits get to be a little bit easier to work with. So these are a couple of designs I've used on milking parlors that I've built. I'll probably just go on this one where you got a pipe going down the middle. This little piece of pipe is welded to this one. This piece of pipe here is welded to this little piece on top, and this thing will actually swivel. We put a little grease in there, and this thing will actually swivel from side to side. So, you know, it might cost 10, 15 bucks to make something like that, but definitely is a lot easier to move the units and to move the hoses when you do have some kind of a swing arm in there. And again, it can help really reduce that unit pull that sometimes we see. So when you take a look at these swing arms that are on here, you can see the difference between these cows here and those previous goats where that unit pull is really pulling out just because they didn't have the swing arms. So again, that's what we're seeing here is just, again, that unit pull. So when you take a look at the wash manifolds and just the drawers, I much prefer the drawers. It just seem like it keeps everything kind of out of the way. You can still put 2 units onto one manifold if these are kind of cowl manifolds, which kind of tend to work, I think, pretty nice. You can see that they got manifolds down under here. And they also have the manifolds here, but again, I would tend to prefer the drawer type ones. But again, there is a little bit more cost with that as well. When we take a look at the different types of headlocks in here, for the most part, the people are using kind of the stanchion lever stanchion type system for when the cows or the goats are actually in here. You'll see dividers in between the grains. And I noticed that when I was milking goats, they would steal a lot of grain and they just got so fidgety and how mean they might have been from one goat to the next, just fighting for that grain. So I think those are kind of a nice thing to put down into it. The down ramp you'll notice here, and I think the thing on the down ramps, just make sure that they've got some angles. So sometimes when you get into that 45-degree angle, that's a pretty good size angle for a goat to actually get up to. If you get down to that 33-degree angle, even 25% degree angle, I think that's a nice one to work with. And the other thing is Brian mentioned that ventilation. Just don't forget about the ventilation within the milking parlor as well, because there definitely are some ventilation needs, maybe not as much as dairy cows, but there still are some ventilation needs that we have within the parlors as well. So here's a little video of Steve Kutch out in my territory here, just how his actually works. So it's a rapid exit type system where this system just runs up in front so the cows can actually leave as he opens the gate, and then they'll actually kind of leave back out the side. So I think it's a really nice system, and it's not an all end one where they leave out here, but they come in this side and they also leave back out that side as well. So the cascade system, again, a lot of people just build this themselves with some welding skills or whatever. So you're basically kind of rotating this on here. And as we look at the video here, basically the goat's going to come into the here. So he's going to hit that, bring this one open, which is going to open up the next one. So when you hear about a cascade system, that basically is a nice way to do it. So without that system, they're going to try to shortchange and try to get into this stall to get the grain here versus go all the way down to the end before they actually get into the stall. So when we take a look at other different types of systems here, just another little video about different types of gating and things like that. And when people want to, just completely walk out of their parlor, just how you can actually make little simple gates to actually do this. We've actually got some producers that do this with dairy cows as well. They're definitely a lot heavier duty type gates, but it's definitely a system that we can use it so you don't have to be stepping up and over different types of things. You can walk straight out of the pit itself. So when you take a look at parlors, so those are kind of the inline parlors, and here we're basically taking a look at a rotary parlor. So again, here's a wash manifold. This is Jim Harder's in Delaware County. He actually built this parlor himself, pretty good intellect trying to build this thing. Just a very simple sprocket that actually runs the system. So there's 24 bale rotary going around here. So the goats will come on the one side here. The grain is actually gravity fed from inside here. And so that'll actually go into their little feed trough, and then it's going to move around here, and he's got each one of them numbered, but a very simple system to seem like it operates. But it definitely was not the easiest one to build. So other types of grain feeding options. Okay, so we do have some auto grain feeders that a lot of people, and this is actually a dairy parlor, dairy cow parlor that they do this, but you can do this with goats quite easily as well. You can hand feed as we do in this one over here, where you can gravity feed like we did in Jim Harder's parlor in the previous slide. There's a lot of different options about trying to feed in the parlor. When we take a look at how do you try to go about building these things, I think a lot of people just maybe call some other people that have them, go look at them, and once they kind of look at them a few times, they start getting the thought process, well, I think I can kind of build it. It's kind of like the 4-H model, you learn to do by doing, and that's how I learned to build milking parlors. I didn't know much about my first one that I was building, but I just decided we're going to do it, and we got it done. So when you take a look at some of these conversions, like for a 12 to 20 does on a side, I mean, $5,000 to $6,000 can go a long way for building a parlor. I know the price of steel has kind of gone up and probably won't come back down, but you can still probably build it for that kind of a fashion for a money. So when you take a look at, small herds in here, so 1 or 2 bucket milkers here, if you've got a herd that's even, 10 does or 15 does, maybe even 20 does, depending on what your time value of your labor is worth, or what you just like to milk them or whatever. I wouldn't count this one out of the picture. Not always a cheap system to work with, but for small herds, I think they kind of work quite well. We've got some carousel type herds and parlors that, when you take a look at some of the things, I mean, sometimes we're spending $10,000 a stall to actually build one of these parlors with all the equipment and stuff like that. And so part of it's just going to be what your labor is worth versus how much capital you might want to own. So when we take a look at different milking systems, again, we just looked at those pictures with the porta milking. We can also do a low cost parlor, 12 does on the side, 24 does on the side. You can put 36 does on the side. I would encourage you to kind of build them, on both sides, not just a single sided one. Try to build them on both sides if we're going to start going into this size where you do a high cost parlor or a carousel. But when you take a look at just the cost, per hundredweight, is that just because of labor, sometimes these smaller systems actually can be quite expensive just because they take us so much labor to actually milk them. So my claim to fame undoubtedly has been with some low cost parlor type things. And so if I can get people trying to milk 150 to 160, even 180 does in a kind of a low cost type parlor, and just because it says low cost doesn't mean that's low efficient. So again, we really try to go after the labor efficiency, the ergonomics, and also the safety factors of these milking parlors to work with. And this is kind of the range that we can try to work with. But again, if you want something that's higher cost, by all means, that's definitely an option as well. So, milking labor costs could be a bigger long-term cost than the parlor itself. So again, when we do something that's not labor efficient, that can really cost us big time in the long run. So rapid exit milking systems is what I would encourage people to go for. I'd also encourage them to go with a double-sided parlor, just because when we only do a single side and we do them a lot longer, we just have so many more steps that we have to take to get from one side of the parlor to the other versus just taking 2 or 3 steps to get to the other side of it. So again, takeoffs, when we take a look at labor efficiency, takeoffs actually, I think, are a very good investment relative to the cost of labor. So again, if we could do something that's a double-sided, something that's kind of in this range between 12 and 24, and I think we can get 1 or 2 people working in there with the takeoffs. I think you can get yourself into that range pretty easy, which I think is very competitive to the market. So a lot of the factors that are affecting efficiency. So what I tend to find, and not just on dairy goat farms, but on cow farms as well, is that there's so many loading bottlenecks. Is that these goats just don't want to come into the parlor for one reason or next. They're taking too many corners. The incline that they have to go up is too steep. They've got a risk of injury. You got some goats that might be a little bit injured that can't really make it up there. Not a crowd gate. And when you take a look at, if you're not feeding in the parlor, it's going to take you probably a little bit more to get those goats in there as well. But just milk production stage, lactation, group size, and just their milkability. Some goats will milk faster, and just the routine that people tend to have. Just a lot of factors that really kind of go into how many goats per person per hour somebody could actually milk in their system. So when you take a look at milking units per stall, I just kind of want us to be kind of careful, because this was actually kind of some data that was published here, and it was basically kind of given a premise that your carousel parlors are that much more efficient than your side-by-side or your low-cost parlors. And I started looking at the data and finding out that their milking units per stall and side-by-side of 1.2. And when you take a look at the carousel, it's just 1 or whatever. So they had a unit for every stall here versus here. I think they're actually milking, 2 does with 1. At least that's what I'm kind of getting at from the thought process. And so when they take a look at their labor efficiencies, by all means, this would be a 1, just because there's a milking unit with every stall here. So the bottom line with milking parlors is that when we see it on the dairy cow side, I mean, I see a 300% different or variation and just their variability of how the many cows they might milk per person per hour. Okay, so if I see that much on the dairy side, I can only imagine I might probably see even more variability on the dairy goat side. So it's kind of just kind of be cautious, I guess, when you start taking a look at numbers and expectations of milker efficiency and things like that. So in this last slide, I know it's a busy slide here, but I'm just going to run real quickly through a double 24 low cost goat parlor versus a higher cost carousel type parlor. So here we're spending $15,000 to build this double 24. Here we're spending $240,000 to build this double 24 at $10,000 a stall. So we've got the interest rate on the money on both sides of it, and you can kind of see what these values are on an annual basis, what the repair costs might be, what the insurance might be. And the bottom line is, to sum it up, when we take a look at these, a 400 goat herd at 2,100 pounds per goat per year, taking a look at what the cost is per hundredweight on this side here, where the parlor itself has not costed much per hundredweight whatsoever, and you add it to the labor of $2.78, you come out with just about $3 a hundredweight to get the goat's milk, what I call a low cost fashion. Here in the higher cost parlor, we're actually looking at about $2.83 a hundredweight to get them milked, just with the fixed cost portion of it. You add the labor into there at $2, and so yeah, we save the labor, actually quite a bit of labor on a per hundredweight basis by using the carousel versus the other kind of a parlor. But when you take a look at the total cost per hundredweight at 200 goats per hour, compared to a system, if I can get 150 goats per hour in my low cost system on a per hundredweight basis, I would tend to say we're probably better off in that low cost parlor type system. But again, as producers, we throw out the options. You guys make the decisions of how much you want to spend and what you want to do with that.
Do the goats need to be fed in the parlor? Do you see any issues with cleaning?
Okay, so do the goats need to be fed in the parlor? And I would tend to say, no, they don't. They are a big enticement. So just like a dairy cow, we don't feed in the parlor for most of them. They tend to be creatures of habit. But when you have a lot of the parlors, the way they're built, where the goats are actually coming down to the end line, and then they're expected to go back out the opposite way versus have to go back out the opposite direction that they actually came in. So it's kind of all in, all out versus all in, and then the last one in is the first one out type of a deal. I think those are a little more difficult, because what entices this goat to actually want to come into the parlor and actually go all the way down to that end stall if there's not a little grain there. So it definitely helps, but again, I wouldn't say it's necessary. I think it is pretty necessary that you have a headlock on the goats. Otherwise, they're going to, like I said, they're going to be jumping all over the place, fighting with each other. And that stall divider kind of becomes a pretty important piece, so their eyeballs can't meet each other while they're in their milking phase. But the question with the dirtiness, yeah. So anytime you put grain into a parlor, you're going to have some dirtiness in there. You're probably going to have a few more mice, possibly even some rat problems sometimes that might actually infiltrate in there just because there's that much more feed laying around.
So Larry, you work in robotic dairies for dairy cattle. Are there any options for robotics for dairy goats?
Not that I know of, but I suspect they may be coming at some point here too, because all you need to do is entice the goat to get into their into the parlor stall with a feed. So I haven't heard of any. Europe's definitely going to be a place if they're going to come out. They're going to come out someplace in Europe first of all, and suspect Holland might be the country if I was going to pick a country where they might come out of. So so I don't know of them any of out there now, but I suspect they're probably in the thought process.
All right, and then we had another question in here. What's the best way to clean the milk lines in a parlor?
Okay, so if you're selling milk commercially, you're basically with just like a dairy cow parlor, you're going to have the wash lines in there. You're going to be going through a sanitation and a washing process with that to wash the milk lines, because it's got to be up to code with the just with all the legalities that each state's going to have, and plus with the federal laws that govern any kind of milk production that's actually sold, for human consumption. You're going to have some issues with the laws there. So just like a dairy cow parlor is going to get cleaned with those milk lines, you're going to be doing the exact same thing with these dairy goat parlors. And so for those that are doing self-cleaning, like say you've got the porta milker and you're doing bucket milker, what I would tend to do is, afterwards you got to take them through some kind of a rinse cycle, and whether that's just be sticking the bucket into a sink or whatever, getting that thing rinsed off, or some kind of spraying it off, and then it's going to go through some kind of a wash. And then before you use it again, you probably want to have it sanitized with some kind of a chlorine product just to make sure you're getting everything killed before you use it again. And I see there's another question, Jen, on the CAE of the herd. Yeah, so that's definitely a major concern. We had a goat meeting down in Kelowna, Iowa here in December, And Dr. Paul Plummer, that was one of his biggest topics. And just so I'm not a veterinarian, I can't give veterinarian advice, but if somebody has a specific question on that, we would probably have copies yet of Dr. Plummer's handout that we could probably get to somebody if they have a question on that.
Yeah, and Larry, I actually put in the upcoming webinar here on June 14th, where Dr. Plummer is going to address CAE. So if you registered for this webinar, there was options to select for the upcoming webinars. If you need the link to register for that, I can certainly send that out again too.
Yep, those are all good questions.
I'm not seeing any here in the chat box, Larry or Brian, but I appreciate your time here today. And again, you both put in your contact information. So if people have follow-up questions, they can definitely get a hold of you for those maybe more detailed questions that they may have. Just a reminder again, please fill out that evaluation by clicking on the link that I posted in the chat box. And once we get done with the webinar here today, I will send it out. So you have that link if you want to watch it again, or you can view some of our past webinars that we have done. We have a YouTube channel that hosts all of those webinars on there as well. So you can take a look at that. So again, I appreciate everyone being on the webinar here today, and I hope everybody has a really good day. And it looks like somebody's not seeing the evaluation link. So I'm going to post it one more time here. Maybe it got missed in the. Oh, thanks, Brian.
I just put it in there again.
Okay.
So it's down at the bottom.
Okay. I'll wait a little bit before I log off so people can click on that.